The last thing Chase Donovan expected as he stood on the side of a desolate highway, the hood of his sleek black Aston Martin smoking furiously, was for his meticulously planned world to unravel in the middle of nowhere. The car, a symbol of his success as one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the country, now looked as defeated as he felt. His phone had no signal, the nearest town was miles away, and the late afternoon sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Unbelievable," Chase muttered to himself, kicking the tire out of frustration. He adjusted his designer suit jacket, which felt entirely out of place against the dusty roadside. Just as he was debating whether to start walking or wait for a miracle, he heard the low rumble of an approaching vehicle. Turning, he saw a beat-up old pickup truck pulling to a stop a few feet away. The driver's side door creaked open, and out stepped a woman who looked like she belonged more to the earth than any corporate boardroom Chase had ever sat in. Her wavy chestnut hair was tied back in a loose braid, and she wore faded jeans with a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves. She was beautiful in a way Chase couldn't quite define: natural, effortless, and completely unconcerned with the world he came from. "Car trouble?" she asked, her voice light but laced with amusement as she approached him. "Yeah, you could say that," Chase replied, trying to mask his irritation. "Do you know if there's a mechanic nearby?" She tilted her head, her hazel eyes scanning the car. "Nearest mechanic's about 30 miles out, but I can take a look if you want." "I'm pretty good with engines." Chase hesitated, glancing at her small hands and then the car. "I don't think this is a car I'd know how to fix," she cut in, raising an eyebrow. "Suit yourself, but you don't exactly have a lot of options out here," Chase sighed, stepping aside. "Fine, be my guest." She smirked and popped the hood, leaning in to inspect the engine. Chase found himself watching her more than her work, how she bit her lip in concentration. The streak of grease she accidentally wiped on her cheek, the confidence in her movements. She didn't ask for his help or try to impress him, she just seemed real. After a few minutes, she straightened up and wiped her hands on a rag she pulled from her back pocket. "Looks like your radiator's shot. You're not going anywhere until it's fixed." "Perfect," Chase muttered sarcastically. "So what now?" "Well, I'd offer to tow you, but my truck's not exactly built for that. Best I can do is give you a lift into town. You might be stuck overnight, though." Not many places open this late. Chase glanced at his car, then back at her. "I don't suppose you have a better suggestion?" "Nope," she said with a grin. "Name's Harper, by the way." "Chase," he replied, extending a hand. She shook it firmly, her grip surprisingly strong. "Nice to meet you, Chase. Now grab whatever you need from your fancy car, and let's go before it gets dark." Chase grabbed his leather briefcase and a small overnight bag from the car, then climbed into the passenger seat of Harper's truck. The interior smelled faintly of pine and motor oil, and the seat creaked under his weight. As they started down the road, Chase couldn't help but glance over at her. "So, Harper, do you make a habit of rescuing stranded strangers on the side of the road?" she chuckled. "Not really, but you looked like you needed help." "And well, you don't exactly blend into the scenery around here," Chase smirked. "What gave me away, the suit or the car?" "Both," she said, glancing at him with a teasing smile. "You're not from around here, are you?" "Not even close," Chase admitted. "I was on my way to a business meeting in the city. Took a detour to avoid traffic and ended up here." "Big shot businessman, huh?" Harper teased. "Must be tough being so far from your skyscrapers and five-star restaurants." Chase couldn't tell if she was mocking him or just being playful, but he found himself smiling despite the situation. "It has its challenges." They drove in companionable silence for a while, the truck rattling over the uneven road. Eventually, they reached a quaint little town that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Harper pulled up in front of a small inn with a weathered sign that read Maplewood Lodge. "This is the best place in town," Harper said as she turned off the engine. "It's not fancy, but the rooms are clean, and the owner makes a mean stack of pancakes in the morning." Chase opened the door and stepped out, looking up at the building. It was a far cry from the luxury hotels he was used to, but he didn't have much choice. "Thanks for the ride," he said, turning back to Harper. "No problem," she replied, leaning out the window. "Good luck with your car. Oh, and Chase." "Yeah, maybe try relaxing a little while you're here. You might surprise yourself." With that, she gave him a wink and drove off, leaving Chase standing on the curb, feeling oddly unsettled. As he checked into the inn and settled into his modest room, Chase couldn't stop thinking about Harper. There was something about her confidence, her authenticity that had caught him off guard. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd met someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, someone who saw him as just another guy stranded on the side of the road. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself hoping he'd see her again. The next morning, Chase was woken by the sound of birds chirping and the faint smell of bacon drifting through the air. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he adjusted to the soft morning light filtering through the lace curtains of his room. It wasn't his penthouse with blackout shades and a state-of-the-art espresso machine, but it had its own charm, a quiet simplicity he hadn't experienced in years. After a quick shower, he dressed in the only casual clothes he had, a pair of jeans and a crisp button-up shirt that somehow felt out of place in this setting, and headed downstairs. The inn's small dining area was bustling with locals chatting over coffee and hearty breakfasts. A friendly older woman behind the counter waved him over. "You must be the fella Harper brought in last night," she said warmly, setting down a plate of pancakes and bacon. "Name's Evelyn. I run this little place." "Sit down, have some breakfast." Chase hesitated, unused to such casual hospitality, but he nodded and took a seat. "Thanks, Evelyn." "I appreciate it." As he poured himself a cup of coffee, the door to the inn swung open, and there she was, Harper. She strode in with her usual confidence, her braids slightly undone, her flannel shirt tied loosely over a tank top. She spotted him immediately and gave him a grin. "Well, look who's adapting to small-town life," she teased, sliding into the seat across from him uninvited. "How's the luxury accommodations treating you?" Chase smirked. "Surprisingly tolerable. Though I can't say it's quite what I'm used to." Harper laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I bet. I figured I'd swing by and see if you wanted a ride to the mechanic. They've got your car already, but it's gonna take a couple of days to get the part they need." "A couple of days," Chase repeated, setting his coffee down. "I can't stay here that long." "I've got meetings, obligations, relax, city boy," Harper interrupted, leaning back in her chair. "You'll survive a few days without emails and conference calls. Besides, maybe it's the universe telling you to slow down for once." Chase opened his mouth to argue but found he couldn't. There was something disarming about Harper, her directness, her complete lack of pretense. He sighed. "Fine, but what am I supposed to do while I'm stuck here?" Harper's eyes sparkled mischievously. "Lucky for you, there's more to life than boardrooms and spreadsheets. I'll show you around." Consider it a crash course in how normal people live. Before Chase could protest, Evelyn appeared with another cup of coffee and a knowing smile. "Sounds like a good plan to me." "Harper knows all the best spots in town." Chase raised an eyebrow at Harper. "Is this how you treat all stranded strangers, or am I just special?" Harper grinned. "You're special, all right. Come on, finish your breakfast. We've got a big day ahead." By mid-morning, Chase found himself in Harper's truck again, bumping along a dirt road that wound through rolling fields and dense woods. She'd insisted on taking him to what she called the real heart of the town. Their first stop was a small farm on the outskirts of town, where Harper introduced him to an older couple who ran a roadside produce stand. Chase watched as Harper effortlessly charmed them, helping to load fresh tomatoes and corn into a basket. She handed the basket to Chase with a smirk. "Think you can handle carrying that, or is it too much manual labor for you?" Chase chuckled. "I think I'll manage." From there, they visited the town's tiny general store, a park with a duck pond, and finally, a local diner where Harper seemed to know everyone. Chase couldn't remember the last time he'd been surrounded by people so genuine. They greeted Harper like family, their smiles warm and their laughter infectious. It was a stark contrast to the cutthroat world he was used to. As the day wore on, Chase found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Harper had a way of pulling him out of his own head, whether it was by teasing him about his city slicker ways or challenging him to skip rocks across the pond. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, bold, unfiltered, and completely unconcerned with impressing him. And yet, he found himself wanting to impress her. As the sun began to set, Harper drove them to a secluded spot overlooking a wide field of wildflowers. She parked the truck, climbed into the bed, and patted the space next to her. "Come on, you've got to see this." Chase followed, sitting down beside her as the sky exploded into hues of orange, pink, and gold. The air was cool and quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Pretty amazing, huh?" Harper said softly, breaking the silence. Chase nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it." "That's because you're too busy running around in your glass towers and fancy cars," she teased, though her tone was gentle. "You ever stop to just be still?" Chase hesitated. "Not really. There's always something to do, someone to meet, some deal to close." Harper turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Sounds exhausting." "It is," Chase admitted, surprising himself with his honesty, "but it's all I've ever known. It's what got me where I am." "And where is that exactly?" Harper asked, her eyes searching his. "Are you happy there?" Chase opened his mouth to respond but found he didn't have an answer. Instead, he looked away, his gaze falling to the wildflowers swaying in the breeze. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper didn't press him. Instead, she leaned back on her hands, her eyes on the horizon. "Well, maybe this little detour is exactly what you needed." Chase glanced at her, his chest tightening inexplicably. There was something about Harper, her openness, her quiet strength that made him feel like he could breathe for the first time in years. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he didn't want this moment to end. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Harper turned to him with a small smile. "Come on, city boy. Let's get you back to the inn. You've got another day of small-town life to survive tomorrow." Chase laughed softly, shaking his head. "You really don't let up, do you?" "Not a chance," she said with a wink, hopping off the truck bed. "Come on, let's go." As Chase followed her back to the truck, he couldn't help but wonder if this detour in the middle of nowhere might just be the best thing that had ever happened to him. The next morning, Harper pulled into the inn's gravel parking lot, her truck kicking up a small cloud of dust as she came to a stop. Chase was already waiting outside, leaning casually against the porch railing with his arms crossed. He'd swapped his usual button-up for a plain navy t-shirt, and Harper couldn't help but notice how the casual look suited him more than it should have. "You're early," Chase said as she climbed out of the truck. His tone was teasing, but there was an unmistakable warmth in his eyes. "You're lucky I'm here at all," Harper shot back with a grin. "I figured you'd be too busy pacing around, trying to find a way to turn this town into a profit." "Not a bad idea," Chase quipped, pushing off the railing and walking toward her. "But I think I'll let you distract me from my capitalist schemes for another day." Harper rolled her eyes, though her smile lingered. "Get in, city boy. I've got a surprise for you." Chase raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, He slid into the passenger seat and adjusted his seatbelt as Harper started the engine. "Do I get a hint, or are you just going to keep me in suspense?" "You'll find out soon enough," Harper said lightly, pulling out onto the road. "Just try to relax and enjoy the ride." 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a clearing by the riverbank, where the water sparkled under the mid-morning sun. A small wooden dock jutted out over the water, and tied to it was a modest motorboat. Chase stepped out of the truck, taking in the scene with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Fishing?" he asked, glancing at Harper as she grabbed a cooler and a couple of fishing poles from the truck bed. "Not just fishing," Harper corrected, handing him one of the poles. "It's about slowing down, soaking it all in. You've got to learn how to appreciate the little things, Chase." "I'm not exactly dressed for this," he pointed out, gesturing to his designer sneakers. "You'll survive," Harper said with a smirk, leading the way to the dock. "Come on, millionaire. Let's see if you can handle a day without your fancy gadgets." Chase hesitated for a moment before following her. Once they were settled in the boat, Harper started the engine and guided them out onto the water. The river was calm, the only sounds the gentle hum of the motor and the occasional call of a bird overhead. For the first time in a long time, Chase felt a quiet sense of peace he couldn't quite explain. Harper cut the engine once they reached a good spot and handed Chase a rod. "Ever done this before?" "Not since I was a kid," he admitted, watching as she deftly baited her hook. "It's like riding a bike," Harper said, showing him how to cast the line. "Just don't overthink it." Chase gave it a try, his first cast landing with a splash a few feet from the boat. Harper laughed, the sound light and infectious. "Not bad. You might just survive out here after all." They spent the next hour trading playful barbs and quiet moments, the conversation flowing easily between them. Chase found himself opening up in a way he didn't expect, sharing stories about his childhood, his rise to success, and the sacrifices he'd made along the way. Harper listened without judgment, her hazel eyes attentive and understanding. "You know," Harper said after a while, leaning back against the edge of the boat, "you're not as uptight as I thought you'd be." "Gee, thanks," Chase said dryly, though he was smiling. "And you're not as stubborn as you pretend to be." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Who says I'm pretending?" Chase chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the boat gently rocking with the movement of the water. Harper glanced over at Chase, her expression softening. "You know, for someone who seems to have it all, you sure don't look happy." Chase looked at her, caught off guard by the comment. "What makes you say that?" Harper shrugged, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I don't know. You're always so guarded, like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Maybe it's none of my business, but it just seems like you're chasing something that doesn't really make you happy." Chase didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the water, her words sinking in. "I don't know if I even know what makes me happy anymore," he admitted quietly. Harper turned to him, her voice gentle. "Maybe it's time to figure that out." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fade away. There was something in Harper's gaze that made Chase feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. It was both terrifying and comforting, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. Before either of them could say anything, Harper's line jerked, and she let out a laugh. "Looks like I've got one." She reeled in the fish with practiced ease, holding it up triumphantly before releasing it back into the water. Chase watched her, a small smile tugging at his lips. She was so alive, so unapologetically herself, and he couldn't help but be drawn to her. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Harper started the engine and guided them back to shore. Once they were back on land, she turned to Chase with a grin. "Well, did you survive your first real day of fishing?" "Barely," Chase said, though there was a twinkle in his eye. "But I'll admit, it wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be." High praise coming from you, Harper teased, loading the gear back into the truck. Come on. I've got one more stop for us. The last stop of the day was a small, family-owned Italian restaurant tucked away on the edge of town. Harper led Chase inside, where the aroma of garlic and fresh basil greeted them. The owner, a jovial man with a thick accent, greeted Harper like an old friend and immediately led them to a cozy table in the corner. "This place has the best food in town," Harper said as they sat down. "No menu, just tell Tony what you're in the mood for, and he'll take care of the rest." Chase looked around, taking in the warm, inviting atmosphere. It was a far cry from the high-end restaurants he was used to, but there was something about it that felt special. Tony returned a few minutes later with 2 plates of steaming pasta and a bottle of wine. As they ate, Chase found himself relaxing even more, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. Harper's laughter filled the air, and Chase couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease. By the time they left, the stars were out, the night air cool and refreshing. Harper walked ahead of him, her braids swaying as she hummed softly to herself. Chase watched her, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. "Harper," he said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. She turned to him, her smile fading slightly when she saw the serious look on his face. "Yeah, I don't know how to thank you," Chase said, his voice low, "for everything. For showing me this." Harper tilted her head, studying him for a moment, then she smiled, her eyes soft. "You don't have to thank me, Chase, just don't forget it." Chase nodded, though he wasn't sure he could find the words to explain how much the past few days had meant to him. As they climbed back into the truck and drove toward the inn, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. The morning buzzed with a quiet anticipation Chase couldn't quite shake. He stood outside the inn, his phone in hand, scrolling through emails he had no interest in reading. His car was fixed and waiting for him at the mechanic's shop. By all accounts, he should be relieved. Instead, he felt a heavy knot in his chest, one he hadn't been able to untangle since last night. Harper pulled up in her truck, her familiar grin lighting up her face as she leaned out the window. "Ready to get your fancy car back, city boy?" Chase pocketed his phone and walked toward her. "I guess this is the part where you officially rescue me." "Don't flatter yourself," Harper teased as he climbed into the passenger seat. "I'm just making sure you don't get lost on your way out of town." Her words landed heavier than they should have. Chase looked out the window, the passing scenery blurring as the realization settled in this might actually be the last time he'd see her. The drive to the mechanic was quiet, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Harper pulled into the lot and parked, glancing at him. "Looks like your chariot awaits." Chase nodded but didn't move to get out. Instead, he turned to her, his voice low. "Harper, I..." She raised an eyebrow, waiting, but he couldn't find the words. How could he explain that the thought of leaving felt wrong? That in just a few days, she'd managed to dismantle every carefully constructed piece of his life and show him something he hadn't even realized he was missing. "Don't get all sentimental on me now," Harper said with a smirk, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. Chase chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I'll miss you, Harper." The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Harper blinked, her teasing demeanor faltering. "You don't have to make it sound so final," she said softly, "but wasn't it?" Chase wasn't sure. He climbed out of the truck and walked toward his car, the sleek black Aston Martin gleaming in the sunlight. The mechanic handed him the keys, but as he stood there, he felt no relief, no excitement. He turned back to see Harper leaning against her truck, arms crossed, watching him with that same confident ease he'd come to. A door, a door. The thought hit him like a freight train. He loved her. Not in some passing, fleeting way, but truly, deeply, in a way that made his chest ache. and he couldn't just drive away and pretend it didn't matter. Without hesitation, Chase walked back toward her, the keys clutched tightly in his hand. Harper frowned, confused. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done sooner," Chase said, his voice steady. Before she could respond, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, it was bold, certain, and filled with everything he hadn't been able to say. Harper froze for a moment, caught off guard, but then she melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck. When they finally pulled apart, her breath hitched, her hazel eyes wide. "Chase." "I can't leave," he said simply. "Not like this. Not without telling you that you've completely turned my world upside down in the best possible way." Harper stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and vulnerability. "You're serious." "Dead serious," Chase said, his tone firm. "I don't care about the meetings, the deadlines, any of it." "None of it matters if I'm not with you." Harper laughed softly, shaking her head. "You really are something else, you know that." "Is that a yes?" Chase asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Harper rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her grin. "It's a yes, you stubborn millionaire." Chase laughed, relief washing over him as he pulled her into another kiss. 2 months later, the small town buzzed with excitement as word spread about the grand reopening of the old Maplewood Lodge. The inn, once charming but run down, had been completely renovated thanks to Chase's investment. The grand opening was Harper's idea. "If you're going to stick around, you might as well make yourself useful," she'd teased. Now, Chase stood on the newly built deck, dressed in a tailored suit that somehow didn't feel out of place anymore. Harper was beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a flowing green dress that matched her eyes, her hair loose and tumbling over her shoulders. "You've outdone yourself," Harper said, glancing up at him. "All for you," Chase replied, his voice low. Harper rolled her eyes but smiled, leaning into him. "I still can't believe you stayed." "I had to," Chase said simply, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You gave me something I didn't even know I needed, Harper. You gave me a home." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he felt for her. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the crowd gathered at the lodge, Chase pulled Harper aside. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing as he led her toward a quiet corner of the deck. "Just trust me," he said, reaching into his pocket. Harper's laughter faded as she saw the small velvet box in his hand. Her eyes widened as Chase got down on one knee. "Harper," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "I came to this town by accident. My car broke down, my plans fell apart, and I thought I was stranded. But it wasn't an accident, it was fate. Meeting you changed everything. You made me realize what really matters, and I don't want to spend another day without you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Harper's eyes as she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." Chase slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple but elegant design that he'd chosen with her in mind, and stood, pulling her into his arms. The crowd erupted into cheers, but for Chase and Harper, the world seemed to fade away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. They were home with each other, and they always would be.